Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Hannah Greiner. I'm the Manager of Quality Application Advisory Services at Epista Life Science and will be your host during this webinar today. For those of you that don't know us, who's Epista Life Science? We're a consultancy that's dedicated to continuously improving regulatory compliance for our clients as well as the life science industry in general. And one way that we do this is by helping our life science customers transitioning from their on-prem solutions to a cloud computing. We really like sharing our knowledge, and this is also why we're holding this webinar today, to share some of our experience that we've gained with multiple of our life science customers in going cloud. So whether it was with early solution identifications, what is actually the right thing for them, up to the appropriate vendor selection, implementing, as well as qualifying, validating the cloud, and making sure that they stay compliant after their go live. So let's get started. The future is cloud, and more service providers are offering their solutions in cloud only or are encouraging their customers to go cloud to actually achieve all the benefits that it brings along, especially when working internationally and across multiple sites. However, this first jump into the cloud can be a bit scary considering all the life science regulations that you have and that you need to overcome in order to make sure that your cloud is not becoming a huge problem for you. When talking to various customers in the life science industry, as well as just some peers that we have, there is some common misapprehensions that I commonly hear when it comes around, or when it is around using the cloud. So one very common perception is that when you are working in a GXP environment in the life science, you cannot use cloud. So your cloud solution will never be compliant. That is coming a bit from the pharma industry being a bit conservative. So also regulations and guidances that are published are a bit slow in adapting to new technology, how to use that and how to actually be compliant when using them. So very often that then leads to the perception that you cannot use those new technologies at all, and that it's not really encouraged by the life science industry to think outside the box and make sure that you are actually staying ahead of the technology. Another, and going a bit in the other direction there, perception is that when you are going cloud, that means someone else is responsible. So you can just lean back, you can enjoy the ride, there's nothing that you need to do. If there's an inspector coming on site asking, okay, how are you dealing with your data? You just say, well, I have a cloud provider that is doing that. And that can become a huge problem when they are then actually asking you, well, but how do you, as an owner of that data, stay in control of that data in the regulated industry? The third big misapprehension around cloud is that cloud validation and qualification is something that you can just easily adjust to. So pharma companies, life science industry is very used to qualifying and validating systems, also computerized systems. There has been a lot of focus on data integrity in the recent years. So they just go and say, well, we're just going to use the same systems, the same tools, the same SOPs and templates as we've always been doing. And then I would say the latest stage is when you come to your IQ, the installation qualification, that companies then struggle, ooh, how do I actually do that with the cloud setting? So if you are not really prepared in what it means qualifying and validating a cloud solution, that can really lead to serious project delays in the go live, to of course in compliance risks that you have because you're not properly using the systems that you have, or even if all of that works out whilst you are implementing the solution, your QA or IT compliance department might be completely overwhelmed after you go live because all of a sudden you tell them, oh, by the way, there's frequent releases during the year and you just need to revalidate the whole solution. So those are three key aspects that a lot of our customers are struggling with when they want to take that step into the cloud. And this is why we've decided to go for this webinar and share 5 key elements for a successful cloud implementation. So we really want to show what we've been doing, what we've been seeing, and where we've gotten really good experience with certain tools, with certain methodologies to make sure that the jump into the cloud, the first cloud implementation that you're going through, or even maybe the second or third, is a success. As a little limitation, because we only have a limited amount of time available, a lot of the examples that I'll be presenting are coming from a SaaS side, so software as a service side, because that's something that I've been working a lot on recently, but they can equally, of course, be applied to the other infrastructure or platform as a service ways of delivering or providing cloud as well. So what are the 5 elements? First one is the cloud provider. It might sound simple, but you're actually, by choosing your cloud provider, setting yourself up for success or failure. So cloud provider does not equal cloud provider. There's a lot of providers out there now. It's a new business model. It's of course very promising, but they differ a lot when it comes to their offerings and also their level of compliance. And the process that you're applying for going to cloud should not be something that someone decides, someone like, oh, I saw a good offer, that's what we're doing. But it should equal more the process that you go through when you're choosing a new contract manufacturing organization. Because in the end, the cloud provider will be dealing with one of your most valuable goods. So of course, it's your product on the one hand that you're really watching out for, but the data that's related to that is equally important. So the standards that you need to apply are the same. Cloud provider selection starts with the need analysis. So first of all, you need to understand what type of data do you want to store on the cloud. Then the next follow-up question is, what GxP impact or criticality does that data have? So which regulations will actually apply to you going to the cloud with your data? And then, very important, of course, what are the risks that are associated with moving that data on the cloud versus having it on-prem? So the risk assessment that you are doing is pretty much the same that you would do for your normal product when outsourcing certain services. And it should also be the basis then for your vendor screening when you're evaluating and comparing different cloud providers against each other to figure out which one delivers actually the best solution for you. So watch out and be careful. Make sure you know exactly what is important for you and how you are going about your screening process. In the screening process, of course, we need to understand the different providers that are available in the market, and then it is crucial to understand whether or not they have life science experience. If you have a vendor that has no experience with life science industry, there's a great risk that they will struggle with the specific requirements that you have. So you might be asking for certain documentation, certain confirmation, certain support, and they just have no idea what you're actually talking about. So going with a vendor that has no experience or very little experience in that area is an unpredictable risk for your organization. So if you are going with a cloud provider that has life science industry experience, try asking them for a reference customer. So even though they might say, oh yeah, we did some implementations, it's not said that that implementation was actually that good. So if you're able to, make sure you're talking to people that did the transition with this vendor to hear a bit about how they went about that approach and what they would be doing differently if they would do it all over again. And then last but not least, when you are talking and engaging with the vendors that are in your final round, let's say, make sure that you also figure out how willing are they to share the service level agreements that they have, but also to negotiate that. So if you have a vendor that in that initial screening phase, so before you've actually signed any contract with them, to negotiate and also understand and give you a bit more support in certain areas that you need. If they're not doing that in that phase, they will not do that after you've signed the contract. So that is your best chance of actually getting your needs into that contract and making sure that the services that are delivered meet your needs. In the actual vendor qualification, the process is pretty much the same as you would have with any other GxP relevant supplier. So you will do your vendor and delivered service risk assessment. You will write a qualification plan. You will do a vendor assessment or even an audit of the cloud provider to make sure that they are sticking to what they are committing to. And you will then also write a qualification report. One really important thing that I'm going to be sharing on the next slide is something called Cloud Control Matrix that we have been working on with a lot of our customers to establish as part of this cloud provider qualification. simply in order to make sure that the responsibility split that you have with your cloud provider is very, very clear for all parties. And also in the case of an inspection, you can actually show that and say, oh yeah, it's totally set. We know who's doing what and who's monitoring which aspects. Coming a bit back to the vendor assessment or the audit that you're doing, make sure that you are auditing, but also in general validating what the cloud provider is offering you. So what you're looking into will depend a bit on whether it's an infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service offering. Also make sure that if there is any additional support, they might be offering validation support for your solution. Maybe there's some managed services that they have after go live. Make sure that whatever they are offering, what you're signing up for and what you need is actually covered in this validation, and of course also the assessment or the audit. Independent of which cloud provider you choose and where they position themselves, they must have a quality management system. Otherwise, it's not possible for you to actually use them in a life science setting. So they need to have some way of describing that quality management system. They must have a set of procedures that they are following when it comes to development of the software solution, when it comes to the deployment of that, when it comes to maintenance, to hot fixes, bug fixes, new releases. So that is something that if they tell you we're a software development company, we're a cloud provider, we don't have that, that is just not appropriate. They're not the right candidate and the right partner for you. And then last but not least, as a little tip there, there's a lot of standards out there from the software industry. There is certifications that have pretty much nothing to do with GXP, but they have some really detailed requirements. There is some proof of the company or the cloud provider working according to that. So if they are offering any certification like them, ask them, take it, but make sure you are actually reviewing it against the requirements that you have. So they are not identical to GXP requirements, but sometimes you are able to actually say, okay, certain things are covered in this other certification, in this other standard, and you can say this is covered through another certification and audit, and you don't need to look into that yourself. So coming to what I've mentioned before, the cloud control matrix, which is pretty much just a list that has all the applicable regulatory requirements, whether that is 21 CFR Part 11, if it's EU, GMP, Annex 11, whatever other standard you have that your company needs to work against, you are listing on the one hand. Then you can match them, as mentioned, against other standards. So if there's some SOC certification that the cloud provider has, and you say, oh, there's a requirement that actually matches the GXP requirement, just make sure you list it, because that way you can have an easy traceability if they have an issue in another certification or standard that they are following to. Then the key and the heart of the matrix is then the split of responsibilities. So make sure that you really list what part of this requirement will be fulfilled by the cloud provider and what part of this requirement they say must be fulfilled by their customer. If you are then comparing the sum of that, so what is the cloud provider doing, plus what are you as a customer to do, and compare that against the regulatory requirement, there might be some gaps where you say, okay, apparently according to what we have in the SLA, in the contracts, in the concept that the cloud provider supplied you with, there's something that we're still missing. And that's where then the key comes up, where you are on the very right-hand side, defining your control strategy. So how are you going to go about that? And then, of course, really, really important, make sure to say, is that something that you need to get into the service level agreement? Is there some other type of contract or agreement that you get in? Is it where you will establish an SOP? Is it maybe something where the cloud provider will establish another SOP? So how are you going to go about that? And if you look at that matrix as a whole, in the end, it's not very different to what you normally do with all your on-prem solutions. So if you are assessing something that you're using in a GXP environment, you say, I need to follow 21 CFR Part 11 or Annex 11, you're comparing, saying, okay, this is the requirement, those things that I don't have, what is my control strategy for that? So it's, from that perspective, not that different, but you're just working with a third party there. Some tips and tricks around that. As mentioned before, since regulators are not that quick in updating the requirements that they are phrasing or the guidances that they have, you will sometimes be required to work with interpretations of existing requirements. If you do so, if there's something that is not one-to-one translatable to your cloud solution and you're interpreting, you're translating it for cloud computing, make sure that you are writing that down in your matrix as well. Because that way you will, in 3 years, when you have the next inspection, someone says, okay, why did you actually define their strategy like this? Always refer back to and say, yeah, this is our interpretation of the requirement. And it will also make it easier if there's an update to the actual regulatory requirement to see if your interpretation and translation of that is matching this newly phrased way from the regulators. Yeah, overall, make sure that your control strategy and this matrix that you're setting up is simple to understand, easy to understand. You don't want someone with expert knowledge. You don't want your cloud provider to come in and be able to or needed to explain what is meant by something. Make sure you really understand that, because this is the heart of what you'll be presenting during audits and inspections, to say this is how we actually make sure that we stay in control of the services that are delivered. That was the first element of a successful cloud implementation. If you now have chosen your cloud provider, you've signed the contract and you're starting, next up is your quality management strategy, meaning that you need to change your QMS in order to control a service. So the qualification and validation of your cloud solution is not a one-time activity. It's not like you're buying a pH meter or you're buying an HPLC and you once do an activity, then it's standing on your site at your site and you don't have anything to do. You actually purchased a service. So there's something that will constantly flow, and you need to make sure that your QMS is able to manage that appropriately. I have here on the right just a little overview of typically the split between the on-premise, where really everything is in your control, and then going to IIS or finally also SAS, where most of the services are outsourced. So when you are talking about changing or adjusting your QMS, you need to make sure that you are monitoring, that you're requalifying your cloud provider. You need to think about how often do you review contracts, how often do you review queue agreements or whatever you have in place, how often will they be revised, can this be something that's only initiated by the cloud provider, what are the lead times for you to react to any changes that might be coming there, because you're outsourcing your GXP data management. So this is very similar again to outsourcing something to a CMO. And then, of course, if you're defining all those activities that you have to do frequently in order to make sure that you stay in control of the service that is delivered, use your risk assessment that you did in the beginning, the criticality of the data, the criticality of the service that you have, to actually define how often do I need to do that and into which depth do you need to go. This is a little example of a wheel, a compliance wheel that we like to draw when it comes to cloud computing. So really defining which activities have to be done weekly or even daily, which activities have to be done monthly, quarterly, or yearly. So again, this should be a risk-based decision, and it will largely depend on the split of responsibility that you have. But looking at one of the examples where we've been implementing an ECM SaaS solution, typical things that you will monitor as part of this annual wheel will be backup and disaster recovery reports that you will get from your cloud provider. It's penetration testing reports, performance reports, availability reports, then of course also audit reports, especially if you are relying on some other certifications that they do. Make sure that you are also reviewing the audit reports that they, for example, receive according to their SOC certificate, just to make sure that if there's a gap identified, you're also aware and can assess if that has an impact on the service that is delivered to yourself. And then of course, last but definitely not least, the SLA. So that's your basis of the contractual agreement. Make sure that that is in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, still meeting your expectations and your needs. This wheel on the right hand side sounds pretty simple. It's not difficult listing several items there, but when you are setting this up, when you are defining how often do you do something, and actually also the people that review those documents, make sure that you actually understand it. So this is not a pure compliance activity where you say a document is there, it's set to have 15 pages and there's 15 pages and it was signed, but actually understand how they're set up. How is backup working? How is the disaster recovery working? How are they testing the penetration, or how are they setting up penetration integration testing. So you will likely have an interdisciplinary team internally, or at least people that have a certain IT knowledge and understanding to support you in those activities, just to make sure that whatever you're getting delivered from your cloud provider is not just sign off as being available, but actually the content is okay for you and you do not see any risks that are coming from that. That said, with everything that I've said here, never forget, because this is still a computerized system in the end that you're using, all your standard periodic review activities that you have for occurred failures, that you have deviation, changes, users that have access to the system. So everything that you would typically do for a computerized system in a GXP environment, of course, still applies to all of that. But there is just those extra systems because you have a service that's outsourced that you will have to review in a way of reports that you receive from external. So next up, next important element is the validation. That's normally a tricky one. So my big recommendation is always cloud providers or CXOs. You had your needs analysis, you did select them, you qualified them. They are like any other CXO that you have. Treat them as such, meaning that you will always, if you are working with partners, if you're outsourcing activities, you need to rely on them fulfilling their responsibilities. So that is why you have the qualification. That is why you have the audit. So if you said they are qualified, you do trust also your CMO that they are able to qualify and maintain their daily infrastructure and operations. You're not there every day asking, how's that going? Send me the report, the IQ, OQ, PQ of every single manufacturing line that they have. So the same applies for your cloud. So really look at what is supplied to you, and that's where it then gets a bit tricky. Differentiate between what is the off-the-shelf application, in this case, if we're talking software as a service, and what are things that have been configured or customized for you. So the off-the-shelf, the standard, let's say, application that's provided by the cloud provider should be, if you chose the one correctly, be validated. So that is something where you qualified the vendor to deliver the validation. What you then need to look into though is, and that is just pretty much following the standard GAMP5 model, what you're changing. So you will always have a URS and some sort of performance testing or user acceptance testing, as it's often called in that context, for the off-the-shelf solution. If you're going a layer deeper and you say there has been certain configurations that were done specifically for you, you should go a step deeper and actually look at functional specifications that you have for those configurations, and also make sure that the appropriate configuration specifications are available. When you are then doing the testing, make sure that you are testing that the right configuration is set up and that it's actually functioning in a way that you anticipated. If you are going all the way down and you're actually doing some customization or requesting customization, those things that you have been customizing, you of course even need to go one level deeper and make sure that this customization is working for you. Looking at one of the examples, again coming into a SaaS solution, which was an electronic document management system, which was set up for a life science customer with configurations only. So there was no customization, but still we changed a little bit from the off-the-shelf delivered application. So what did we actually do in all those individual steps? So we started out with the URS, of course. There's the general things that everyone knows. We were specifying regulatory requirements that we had for the use of the EDMS. We were specifying all the non-functional requirements and, of course, the high-level functional requirements that we had. When we were then going further down into the functional specifications, we were drawing up the process flow, saying, okay, how are we actually using the system, and very much focusing on those functionalities and those flows for the documents that we were changing. We were still referencing what the vendor had been doing. They had requirement specifications for standard functionality, but again, we were playing around a bit with that, changing the system. So we were specifying that in those overarching flows. One level below that, we then also had a configuration handbook where we were defining those configuration settings that were specifically set up for the life science customer, and for everything else, referring to the extracted configuration report from the off-the-shelf solution. So again, saying off-the-shelf was something that's in control, that's part of the SaaS delivery. So we are referencing it, we are documenting it, but we are really putting the focus on the changes that were done. Then during the testing on the right side, we were doing the configuration verification, so making sure that the configuration specification that we had, those changes that we anticipated, were in there, and we're naturally then also referring to the vendor deployment documentation. So this is the IQ, but it's not really an IQ that you have because you are not on-prem, but really making sure that you have the documentation, everything was deployed accordingly. In the functional testing, you then have the testing of your process flows, where you make sure that actually your documents were processed according to your functional specification, and of course also referencing the vendor OQ, where some standard functionality was testing. And then last but not least, of course, also in the PQ testing the user requirements, making sure that your regulatory requirements are fulfilled, your non-functional requirements, and also making sure that anything that you have written in your SOPs is related to business continuity, that is critical for you because you might have critical data in your cloud, that is tested and validated as well to make sure that your business continuity is ensured. So this is how it looked, just some snips here, and it's on purpose that is blurred. So we were drawing some process flows, as you can see, really saying how we're plugging and playing with the standard functionality that was available in the system already, and then really doing the functional description of that. So what is happening, what are the options that we have, who's allowed, what are the security settings, what is GXP criticality of that, and really also putting a focus on differentiating between what is off the shelf or out of the box configuration and what were the things that we were actually changing in that, in order to then enable our testing to be set up in a meaningful way and not just duplicating what the vendor already did. The fourth element of a successful cloud implementation is release management. And that is something where I like to say release management is a full-time job. Of course, it will depend a bit, but I think it's one of the big things that is absolutely underestimated when you are going cloud. So if you are going cloud, that means you are managing change. So before you go live, and actually long before you go live, you need to figure out how will you be dealing with the updates that you are getting. So the big benefit of cloud is, of course, that the solution is constantly evolving. So you're not stuck with a 20-year-old on-prem solution that is not meeting your business needs anymore, but it's actually constantly improving. There's a lot of people using it, there's a lot of feedback, and you actually have the benefit of using those new features that someone else might have identified rather easily. But since we are working in a regulated setting, this means that we need to be fully aware of the changes that are coming and that we need to potentially revalidate what is happening there. So we need to make sure that our solution stays validated. And that is the tricky part. So when talking around the release management or actually the go live and everything that happens, we typically differentiate between two things. One is release management, which is really those releases that are forced upon you. That could be 3 times a year, could be 4 times a year, depending on the solution that you have. And that is the minimum that you have to deal with because you can't say no to that. That is just coming because you are on the cloud. And then the other thing is change management. So those are voluntary enhancements that you want to do because maybe the solution is improved, but there are certain features that are not automatically pushed on everyone. It's just like, well, yeah, that is a feature you could use as well. Or on the other hand, maybe your business is expanding. Maybe you have new processes. Maybe you want to onboard new departments. Maybe there's just new flows that you need to establish. So there's a lot around actually benefiting from that and making sure that solution grows with you. But this is something that you still need to manage and that you need to manage besides all those freaking updates that come through the release management. So when you are thinking about release management early on in your process, way before you are even talking about the validation of your system, make sure you understand the release management process that your cloud provider is following. So what are the notifications that you will receive? Is there fixed days that they are deploying those dates? Can you prepare for that? Is there some environments that they will provide for you up front where you can actually test your configuration or your customized solution with those new features to make sure that it is actually still working with all of that? Look into which documentation they will provide to you, and then also, of course, when will they provide this documentation? Is that after they've already deployed the release, or is that something that you actually get up front? So it is important that by fully understanding that release management, you have the chance to evaluate the potential impact that the release has on your system. So this will be easiest if you just have an off-the-shelf solution. So if you took everything as a standard, then probably if you have a good cloud provider selected, most of these assessments, the revalidation effort, will have been done by your cloud provider. The more configuration and customization you have to be doing, the more you, of course, need to look into the potential impact that those changes in the release have on your solution. So either way, it doesn't matter what you got, if it's off the shelf or if it's configured, customized, you need to look into what you need to do as soon as you receive the release notification, all the activities that happen, and the risk-based approach for that. So yeah, doing this is work. So just asking your QA department, which has never been dealing with cloud and is probably already fully booked, to do this on top of their daily work won't work. So don't underestimate that. Make sure that you have people that are familiar with that know how to deal with that, and that are actually dedicated to doing this task. And again, depends on how often you have a release. You have a release every month, well, then they're probably going to be busy all year. If you know that it happens 3 times a year, make sure that you are in those time periods having people that are available to do that release management. When going back a bit to the release management versus the change management. Again, the difference is that you have certain, let's call them auto-on features that you have that you definitely need to look at before a new release is deployed to your solution. So that is simply to make sure you stay validated, even though the vendor is going into the releases. Overall, the management of that, the validation of the off-the-shelf is something that is purely in the responsibility of your cloud provider, but you, of course, need to make sure that with your solution it works. For anything else that you have, so adopting new configurable features or having some requests from your departments, from your organization to change something in the system, is recommended to do after release. So mixing those two can always, or possesses the risk that you're not really sure if something is not working out afterwards. Was this now coming from the release or the change that you were doing? So if you can keep them a bit separate, we have made really good experiences. We're really making sure you have a release cycle, and then in between have a cycle for your change management where you have some continuous updates that you can do. Also important, make sure that when you are talking those changes, that you're not somewhere describing that any change that happens to the system will require full validation, but really be crisp on what type of changes requires which actions. Try going a bit for what we call standard changes. So what are things that might change but pose a low risk? So you can maybe just go with documenting them, updating certain validation documents you have, or lifecycle documentation. What are things where you actually need to do a configuration verification, so making sure that whatever changes is still working, and where do you need your scripted testing. Apply risk management concepts to that. Don't spend revalidating the whole thing, things that don't have an impact, but really focus on those things that could potentially cause your system to fail. And then, just as a comment on the side, if we are talking cloud constant updates and all the efforts that we have with manual testing, maybe also look into automated testing. See if there's some test tools that you can utilize to make sure that it's not just manual efforts that you have, but that certain features are just constantly tested through your automated test tools. This is one example also from a release management description. So basically there's an 8-week preparation time that you have for a release, really starting with the release announcement that you have, then looking into all the changes that are coming with the release, doing an impact assessment. This cloud provider was actually offering webinars, so you could also see how those new features would look like. And they were pretty early on providing so-called pre-release environments. So they were then allowing you to actually test the new features with the specific configuration or customization you had. Important is that when you first get this brief overview of what the features are, how it actually looks, understand that you are then testing it, that you are preparing your computerized system validation package, having your change control, as well as, of course, your end user communication and potentially even your end user training to make sure that by the time that the release is then deployed to your system, everything's ready for that. And yeah, that is a cycle that you then go through several times a year. So that brings us to the last aspect or element of a successful cloud implementation, and that is the exit strategy. That sounds simple, and actually can be a bit tricky, but the important thing is you've selected a cloud provider, and before, and really before you move any data to the cloud, you need to know how you will be able to get that data out again. So that should be part of your vendor selection process to really see, okay, what does the solution offer to make sure that you can get your data out again. Also important that you have contracts in place that will make it mandatory for your cloud provider to delete data at some point from their cloud after you have stopped working with them. Just mentioning also GDPR there, which I'm not going to be focusing on, but there's of course a few things that you need to consider, but in general also your data after you stop using the service, you of course want to make sure that you exactly know how long is this data still available, how long can you extract it from the system, but then also when is it really not available on the cloud anymore. Also make sure that data can not only be extracted, but it can easily be extracted and also in a meaningful and reusable format. So likely if you are moving to the cloud with the system, you will be hosting a lot of data there. So it's nothing where you then want someone to have manual effort in making sure that you can convert that data again, but make sure that you actually get it out of the system in a way that you can process it again, that you can move it to new systems, that you can archive it, whatever you need to do there. Important in that regard is that, as mentioned, since this is part of your vendor selection, this is also something you should really define in your user requirement specification already. So what is your requirement for retrieving data from the cloud? And then also making sure that this works accordingly. So test that during your validation, make sure that it works, but then also look at this as the system evolves. So you might have new releases, there's new functionalities, new feature, new types of data that you can get in. Just make sure that you are staying on top of that and that you are not at some point confronted with, well, I was able to extract everything 5 years ago, but now that I actually want to leave, there's certain data I can't extract in a meaningful way. So really make sure that you are including that into your release management and that you are including this aspect in your change management. Naturally, data extraction is something that also inspectors are looking at. So I think that's one of the main things that I've heard from inspectors, like, yeah, companies never think about how to get their data out again. So make sure that even though you're right now not doing it, you have an SOP somewhere that defines how you can get data out. So that is just part of your overall lifecycle management of the cloud, that you say this is a worst case scenario that we have, but it's something that we have a procedure for. And then when you have that, of course, make sure that you're following up on that you are updating it. And yeah, I mentioned it before, also GDPR. I'm not the expert on GDPR, but there are several requirements you will have in that regard as well. So also make sure that you are not only for the exit strategy, of course, but that you are building in those requirements as well, and that is suitable. There might be some restrictions also in server locations that you have. So that is something where yeah, you also, when you are selecting your cloud provider, when you are reviewing the SLAs, when you're updating SLAs, when you're expanding, you're having new sites that you're onboarding, that you should be clear and crisp how you deal with this situation and the service that you have. Yeah, so to sum it up, the 5 aspects or 5 elements that we've seen are really key to being successful with transitioning to the cloud provider. So really set yourself up for success. You can make your life way harder than it has to be if you choose the wrong service provider. Don't try not to let anyone overrule you there and say, well, we went with that cloud provider because they had a nice, fancy, cheap offer, but actually make sure if you want to use it for GXP data that you select it like you would select any other GXP system. QMS strategy, really work on your QMS strategy right away. So by the time that you know which solution provider or which cloud provider you will be selecting. Make sure that you are setting up your system, that you know what are they delivering, what can I expect from them, what do I need to do on my side. So plan that in, because if you need to update your SOPs, if you need to train people, if you need to try out those things whilst you're in the middle of validation and you have the pressure of going live, you will likely miss something there. For validation, don't do too much, don't do too little, be smart about it, but of course, don't just do something because you say, well, it's cloud, I don't care. Document it, be clear and crisp on who's doing what and why that is okay, and in alignment with the regulations that we currently have. Maybe as a little side note, I mean, we are expecting regulators to actually come up with some more guidance on how to use cloud computing. So keep an eye out if you are seeing some new guidelines or guidances that are published, and then just compare them with your cloud control matrix, for example, with your qualification validation documentation, just to make sure that the way that you've been doing it a couple of years ago is actually reflecting the inspector's view moving forward. So there will be something to do, but still validate them in a way you would with a CXO. So you are outsourcing, you have contracts, so you do not need to review and approve every single thing that they do, but do a proper audit and make sure that whatever they commit to do and what you're outsourcing is actually working. Release management, again, release and change management is a full-time job. This is nothing that happens on the side anymore. Your system changes way more frequent than any on-prem solution that you have. That is great. It's also keeping people more engaged, more satisfied with the solutions, because they actually see that their needs will be met, but make sure you also have the resources that can actually deal with that and that understand also what it means to go into release management and to initiate certain changes. And then exit strategy, last point, prepare for the worst. Make sure that you're upfront thinking about that you're not getting stuck in a situation where you're retrieving your data from a cloud solution in a way that you cannot reuse them, and then you're either forced to stay with that cloud provider even though you're not satisfied with the services that are delivered, or they've changed their delivery model, or worst case, it's even a cloud provider that stops offering those services. So, well, you either get your data out of it, or they're just going to delete all of it. Make sure that you have that in place, tested, validated, and be confident when someone comes and says, okay, how are you going to deal with getting data out and working without cloud, that you have a solution for that. Yeah, with that, thanks again for joining us today. Sadly, we don't have the possibility to take any live questions here, but if you have any questions to the content that was provided, if you want to hear a bit more about some detailed examples of how we've been helping companies to transition into cloud, if you have very specific questions of how do we deal with something, reach out. You have the contact details, write an email, call us, and we're happy to share whatever we know and help you with making your cloud transition a success as well.